It begins with recognizing the deep inequities that live among us. By making visible the invisible and bridging these vast divides, it sparks determination, not pity. It demands challenging the status quo, the courage to take paths less traveled, and the willingness to immerse in the shared truths of our vulnerabilities. It makes philanthropy work for communities, not for privilege. It calls for nurturing trust and radical kindness, the empathy to explore possibilities, and the humility to accept these in our oneness. It's the fierce ambition to be uncompromising, to satiate the hunger for learning, and to have the audacity to amplify the most vulnerable of voices. It requires perseverance, intelligence, and gusto, true moral courage for sustenance. It inspires leadership that adjusts the sails to catch the wind, to imagine possibilities in pursuit of a higher purpose, bigger than ourselves, but that together is surmountable. Dasra, it combines the power of the mind and the courage of the heart to tackle large-scale inequities, building an India that we all deserve, thriving with dignity and equity.
A very good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Dasra Philanthropy Week 2023. We are so glad to have you all join us today. Dasra Philanthropy Week is currently in its 14th edition, and it has always stood as a platform to bring together diverse stakeholders and voices from the development ecosystem to convene, converse, and continue sustained action towards the quest for 1 billion Indians to thrive with dignity and equity. We're delighted to share that this edition is hosting 40 plus sessions across diverse themes, hear voices of 100 plus thought leaders, and have more than 2,000 plus attendees tuned in for both our in-person and virtual events. This is the most extensive spread of programming we've ever had at the Dasra Philanthropy Week. With this, I'd like to welcome you all to the last session of DPW 2023, Future of Philanthropy in the Global South, a self-sustainability lens. This session is being held in partnership with Center for Strategic Philanthropy, University of Cambridge. It is my pleasure to now hand the floor over to Dr. Nitya Mohan Khemka from PATH. Over to you, Nitya.
Thanks very much, Etna. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to discuss how philanthropy in the Global South can become more independent of its reliance on large Northern foundations. My name is Nitya Mohan Khemka, and I'm a director at PATH, which is a global NGO working on health equity. I'm also a visiting fellow at Judge Business School at Cambridge University, working with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, where we're about to launch an edited volume titled Reimagining Philanthropy in the Global South, From Analysis to Action in a Post-COVID World. So our primary goal for today is to discuss pathways for philanthropy in the Global South to be independent of its reliance on Northern foundations. We will be exploring this topic and theme through conversations, case studies, and best practices, talking to our panelists so that we can really understand how philanthropy in the Global South can take on a self-sustainability lens. We're joined by our panelists today who have contributed to the book in very important ways. Specifically, the book will highlight the North-South relationship in philanthropy and the unequal power balance that it has often characterized it. As we're all aware, the pandemic has unearthed deep-rooted fragilities in our societies and economies. And as a result of this, assumptions of how development is being delivered are being reevaluated. With governments now under intense pressure from electoral cycles due to the pandemic, philanthropic capital can play a very critical role in addressing many of these challenges, both in terms of actually mobilizing financial resources, but also as development actors in their own right. And while there have been high levels, I think, of philanthropy in the global south, it is clear that the urgency and unexpectedness of COVID-19 has shaken up the parameters within which philanthropy operates. This edited volume presents a snapshot view of how newer models of private philanthropy in the global south are grappling with the most pressing development challenges. We have multidimensional poverty, widening inequality, health inequity, and climate change. The curated essays in this book will provide a frank assessment of emerging market philanthropy, priorities really of emerging market philanthropy, challenges and solutions for the future, and indeed, what are the lessons we've learned from how the pandemic has affected giving? Through our contributing authors, some of whom are present today, we explore in the book some of the real COVID-induced sectoral changes and the responses to them in emerging markets. A little bit more about the book. The book is organized around three principal themes. The first pillar is around building networks, infrastructure, capacity, and knowledge. The second pillar is about forging multi-stakeholder partnerships, and that talks about global South governments, global South philanthropists, and civil society. And finally, we have a third pillar on creating resilience, which is philanthropic financing for sustainable development. But more on that later. I'd like to introduce you to our three panelists today. We have Claire Woodcraft, the former executive director and fellow of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at Cambridge, who has edited the book along with myself and our colleague, Professor Kamal Munir, who sadly is not here with us today. We have Rumana Hamid, Managing Trustee, Sitla Foundation, and we have Deval Sanghvi, partner and co-founder of Dasra. Rumana and Deval have contributed important chapters to the book, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with them. So thank you for being here today and taking part in this very critical conversation. And if I may, I'd like to start with Claire. Claire, as the former executive director of the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, I was wondering if you could give us really a snapshot of the CSP research on the power balance in the sector that really underlies, I think, the spirit of this book and how the CSP aims to support the work of philanthropists in the global south. Over to you, Claire.
Thanks so much, Nitya. Great to be with everybody here today. And thank you to Dasra for inviting us to share our work, which I think only increases to resonate over time. I mean, we started the center in 2020, in March 2020. So I think you're all familiar with what happened in March 2020. And as the pandemic hit, there was a real question in our mind. So how are we going to launch a center on philanthropy? What on earth can we do now that the world has shut down? And we decided that a really great starting point, both for the establishment of the center and for our research work, would be to talk to people in the global south and to ask them how they felt about the current state of philanthropy and what were some of the core challenges that they were facing. So we undertook this piece of research from, I guess, April onwards in 2020, where we interviewed some 30-odd philanthropists working in the global south or working in the global north, but operating in the global south. And as you can imagine, it wasn't easy. And it was, we had to very carefully ask these people for their time because many of them were firefighting on a daily basis and were already coming from very limited resource bases. So we were very conscious that whatever time we asked for them, whatever input they gave us, we needed to use that judiciously and act on it. So I'm delighted that we are here today to talk about the book, which in essence was inspired by this work. But I'm also delighted to see that 2 or 3, however many years later we are on now, we are seeing a movement. We are seeing a movement that absolutely resonates with the theme of this initial piece of research that we did. So I'm just going to take you through this piece of research very quickly to just share with you how, in essence, you know, the genesis of this book in a way was started, and also how we have built the cultural DNA of our foundation. So we were set up as a foundation, a center for research. So the Center for Strategic Philanthropy was set up to look only at Global South markets, because we felt that this was a very under-researched area. And we really wanted to look at how we can bring voice to the Global South. And again, I'm not entirely comfortable using the word Global South because it's overly binary, but that is what we tend to adopt at the moment in the sector. I'm sure we'll collectively come up with a better term as we evolve this work. But when we set out to research and we started talking to these Global South practitioners, I guess the fundamental feeling certainly that I had, so I'd spent my whole career working in emerging markets, in philanthropy, looking at social enterprise, social innovation, social investment. And I guess there was this really strong feeling amongst many of us in the sector that there was something wrong. There was something broken in the system when we were looking at philanthropy. And I guess that was really our starting point to explore some of the power balances. And we set out to look not only at what were some of the core challenges and trends, but how did people feel about this power balance issue, particularly as a global crisis was happening? And one of the reasons we wanted to explore this. So as Professor Kamal Munir, so as Nitya said, our partner in crime in this exercise and very active in the establishment of the center, he was very keen for us to really deconstruct the nature of power. What do we mean by power? And to share his words, power is really defining over the last 10, 20, 30 years when philanthropy has really grown, the parameters of best practice. Power has contributed to creating institutional norms and institutional voids where we see a lack of resources and a lack of capacity often in the Global South. And it's also, to some extent, contributed to a lack of voice, such that knowledge and innovation and inspiration coming from some of these markets is not getting shared as widely as it should have. And that's certainly been my experience of working particularly extensively, for example, in the Arab world, where sometimes, you can see incredibly innovative, as indeed in the case of India, of course, but just incredibly locally driven, grassroots driven examples of innovation that are not out there. When we go and look at case studies on philanthropy, we're taking them from the global north. When we're looking at executive education programs, too often the faculties are coming from the global north. So we at the center really wanted to make sure that we were bringing voice to this innovation, because as Kamal rightly points out, power has allowed us to persuade others to do things that we think they should do. And when we're talking about this, we mean in the context of philanthropy, we mean the sheer size and volume of funds that have historically come from the global north. And when we have that resource dependence on a few big northern foundations, as Kamal said, this means that the parameters in which philanthropy are practiced is set by those institutions. And that can create real challenges. So we went into the market and we asked our interviewees, who were either CEOs or leaders of their organizations of primarily foundations, social purpose organizations, NGOs, or intermediaries, but people who are really hands-on in this space. And we asked them to talk to us. So how does that manifest itself? So this power imbalance, what does it look like? And I'm sure people in this event won't be surprised to hear that it's around just the complexity of doing business, the complexity of engaging with some of these global north institutions, such that resources are deployed often in the wrong direction. So when you're working with high transaction costs, high levels of bureaucracy, you often have funding that is aligned to simply getting that capital to market rather than delivering on the mission. You often have systems where small social purpose organizations with limited resources are blocked out and not getting access to funding because they simply don't have the means to navigate the complexity. So grant proposals that are just too complicated to both submit, but also to report on, to follow up, such that we're ending up skewing flows of philanthropic capital to those organizations that have the most capacity, therein further entrenching the problem of institutional capacity and institutional voids. One of our interviews said a phrase that I particularly like, is the supply side in philanthropy, it doesn't operate any rules, any commercial rules like commercial finance would. It makes the rules of the game, and yet it's completely disassociated from what the actual needs in the market are. and who gets the money, what form it's coming, and how we process that funding. The other element of our research looked at, okay, so there was a huge consensus around how philanthropic capital historically has not been dispersed in a way that is empowering, is that addressing institutional voids, creating capacity and empowering voice. But actually, COVID was doing something interesting. So we asked people, what has happened since the crisis hit? And a lot of them were saying that it's forcing global North organizations to actually start to be more flexible, to actually start to really question the way they're giving funding, to be more pragmatic, to break down some of that bureaucracy, to listen to their grantees, to listen to the circumstances that are happening. And of course, when COVID was happening, this was about getting frontline resources. So this wasn't even about listening to the headquarters in the Global South. It was about listening to the people working really in the field. So that gave us a lot of hope that some of this global funding was actually starting to become more flexible and more pragmatic. We also heard from these practitioners that they themselves were becoming more digital and more innovative. So where in the past, particularly if we looked at large markets where people would have historically to connect, to collaborate, have had to fly long distances, people were suddenly, of course, we all finally discovered the value of Zoom, even though it had been around for a long time, discovering the capacity to use digital platforms, to engage, to share data, to share needs, to communicate that needs, but also perhaps most important, to build network, to build voice. So we heard people saying that where they were able to talk to their forced because of the pandemic to talk to their peers more regularly through digital technology. They were able to gather data, they were able to build voice, they were able to collectively articulate the problem to some of the funders and push for a change in their behavior. So really building that collective power and lobbying, and also becoming more resilient. So we had multiple cases across the globe of where grassroots communities were saying, we simply can't depend on getting resources from the global North. We're going to have to work together. We're going to have to peer fund. We're going to have to peer mentor. We're going to have to build horizontal South-South connectivity and communities to be able to manage our way through the pandemic. We also learned that this was an opportunity. And we decided to translate that into a series of recommendations that essentially became the manifesto for the Center for Strategic Philanthropy right at the outset. So we hadn't planned this. We were planning to set up the center and look at kickstarting a research program over time, building executive education, building convene. But suddenly, very quickly, we found that we were having to crystallize our mission. What exactly were we going to do? How were we going to add value and support these communities who were very clearly articulating to us what the problem was? So this is what we came up with as 3 core recommendations that we were then sending, obviously not just to the Global South, but to global philanthropists and saying, if you want to make philanthropy work, if you want to offset some of the distortions of the past, if you want to offset the inefficiency and the lack of impact of the past, this is how we think that we're hearing you can do it. And the first was really to continue to grow those networks. So where we heard that networks were being created and formed, we were calling for more funding. So often donors are not willing to fund networks. It's not something that's easy to measure. It's an institutional void area. It's perhaps not the most exciting place to articulate to your board of donor trustees the impact you've had, but we thought that this was one of the most powerful ways of getting philanthropic capital to the right place at the right time, is funding networks. And told today, every conference I go to, I call for funding networks. It's a huge opportunity to amplify impact, using peers, talking to peers, and building voice. The second area that we found was really important was lots of examples, particularly in the Global South, where governments had historically sometimes feared the role of philanthropy, feared the role of how this was engaging with civil society. And yet during the pandemic, we had examples from across the globe of governments coming to philanthropic practitioners saying, we need your help. Finally starting to understand that philanthropy can be a strategic partner for government and not a threat. And understanding that philanthropy is not there to duplicate what the government is doing, but to build on it and to build with it. This is risk capital. We can take risks that governments won't. We can come up with solutions that governments can help us scale up. And particularly in the case of COVID, where, of course, multiple governments, I guess all governments globally, were faced with the challenge of how to digitize education, children learning from home. And I can cite several foundations that had been working on this for over a decade, digitizing education, making sure that people in rural areas got access to education suddenly, and they'd been lobbying governments to put this in place, to embed it in the national curriculum, and had failed. Suddenly governments overnight were coming to them and saying, you know, you were talking about that e-platform, that digital learning all those years back. We want it now, ramp it up. So we saw that happen across the globe, of really great opportunities where the digitization of educational platforms was driven by philanthropic capital, philanthropic innovation to support the work of government. And the final area that, of course, for those of you who've been working in this sector for a long time, won't come as any surprise, and we thought we'd said it enough, but apparently we haven't. We still heard from all of the people we interviewed, we need core funding. Yes, programmatic funding is super important, but if we don't have the institutional capacity, if we don't have the right people, the right systems, the right process, you can have the most beautiful programmatic intervention, but it's not going to work, and it's not going to work over the longer term. So I think that particular call to action for donors everywhere in the world just became really powerful. And again, it's something that, you know, that still we see as not happening enough. But there was a lot of fast tracking of that during COVID, and we saw donors drop a lot of conditionality. I had one person on a call explain to me how they were even doing using WhatsApp voice messages as an application process for grant. Just somebody calling up saying, I need X amount of capital to do this tomorrow. Here's the bank account details, get the money to us. And I think that was really, really powerful and inspiring. And that's not to say that, of course, some of this flexibility and pragmatism hasn't retracted since the pandemic has evolved, but there's still an opportunity for us now to say this happened during the pandemic. If it can happen then, it can continue to happen. And I think this is a real opportunity for all of us working in the sector to bring this collective voice of building capacity in the global south and making sure that we are collaborating, working together to help governments understand us and help donors disperse that capital more effectively. So that's really our findings from the report and our research. And then just to close out, this is where, of course, we felt that impact can really happen. If we build on those changes that we saw happen during COVID, we call for that change, we call for the continuation of that change, we can really amplify impact, amplify the work of the SDGs. Funding gaps now gone up to, of course, 4 trillion as opposed to the 2.5 trillion before COVID, because we can push for greater diversity and inclusion for all voices. It doesn't matter how small a social purpose organization you are. COVID showed that people on the front line are the people that know where that capital needs to go and how it needs to be spent. We saw flatter hierarchies. We're already seeing that now. Global organizations really trying to bring local capacity into local markets, not just sitting in headquarters thousands of miles away, and a real better understanding. I would say not a complete understanding, but a much better understanding of how we do exactly what you've been talking about with Dasra. Build resilience and reduce dependency and empower communities. So let me stop there and just say that, so this became this research piece of work that we did during the pandemic. It became a manifesto for our center. It fed into the book project, for which we're delighted to have Romana and Deval contribute to. And we very much believe that this is just the beginning. So we really hope we continue to work together, continue to build this movement, and continue to articulate the real needs of beneficiaries, people on the ground, communities on the ground, that we know can be met by this wealth of philanthropic capital, but we know needs to be done differently. So thank you for all joining us today, and I'll stop there and hand back over to you, Nitya.
Thanks, Claire, for setting the stage for our discussion so comprehensively. Romana, I'd like to turn to you next to ask, how do the findings of the CSP's work in this book resonate with you and your philanthropic activities?
Thanks, Nitya, and thank you, Claire, for including us in the book. Our chapter on strategic health philanthropy is something that, you know, even when we were writing the chapter, we realized that traditionally we focused on maybe hospitals or individuals, and now we had started thinking strategically for ourselves to have an answer that said we want better health outcomes, and how do we achieve that? And so in writing the chapter, we understood for us how we had changed our thinking. And to be honest, COVID helped us because people got isolated. Other illnesses just receded into the background. And then people, our phones didn't stop ringing for home care or for people who were suffering with serious complex illnesses. And other funders, like you said, stood up and said, it's a health emergency. It's something that our people need, and came forward to us. So for me, the book catalyzes that it is possible, right? 25 years ago, as a family, we invested in palliative care, which was unknown. I mean, we're working slowly and silently. We've taken it strategically across the country. There's still, of course, a lot that can be done, but maybe we're proof of concept that you can take a complex, neglected issue, come together, take a risk. I think taking a risk is really important. Working, like you said, with the community rather than against, their wishes and their customs, and bringing in the network, and so thank you very much for spotlighting not just our work, but the work of so many people like us in the South.
Thanks, Ramana. Deval, I'd like to turn to you now to ask similarly, in what ways do the findings of CSP's work really relate to Dasra's philanthropic engagement?
No, thank you. And again, I think it's such an amazing fact that you brought this out right when COVID hit. And I think that was, unfortunately, at times like this makes us realize why these core principles are so, so important. And I think many times those on the giving side forget that the work they do, honestly, in writing the check is nothing compared to the communities we serve. And they're the ones who are working the hardest to lift themselves and their families out of poverty. And it's somewhat ridiculous that therefore we don't really trust those who are working the hardest, closest to these issues, and have been taking on this sort of fight from, well before any of these global donor agencies sort of started supporting these particular initiatives. I know many sort of leading philanthropists today talk about urgency, but let's not forget that these philanthropists waited till they were 50, 60, 70 years old, made ridiculous amounts of wealth, and then started giving back, where the communities that we're all trying to serve from day one have been fighting this battle firsthand. And that's really where the urgency lies. And so I think, Nithya, to your question, I think it was great just to have this book come out in a time where the need was just so great, and the realization how decentralized solutions, especially during COVID, what was happening in one part of Maharashtra or even Mumbai, for example, the needs were very different than another part of the city. And trusting sort of local organizations to make decisions, enabling them to give them sort of the runway to decide what is required, because literally every single day the situation was changing. And again, I think at times we forget that while we are back on Zoom or meeting in person like we were able to do this week in Mumbai with the Philanthropy Week, many of the communities that we're supporting, they've had their version of COVID for generations. And so for them, this is not a blip. This is not something that all of a sudden they didn't have access to water for the first time, or they couldn't leave their house, or their homes were sort of demolished. This is something that they've been going through for generations. And really, it's really important, therefore, for us to sort of understand from them what the KPIs are, because they're the ones who are making these decisions, not us. And then we sort of figure out what frameworks we need to adopt those as it relates to our board, to our funders, but it's really just changing the dynamic pretty quickly. And I think what's ludicrous, at least in our minds at Dasra, is in the business world, you make equity investment, you trust entrepreneurs, you wait 7 to 10 years for some sort of return on investment to occur. But in the NGO side, the same investors, smart investors, turn off their minds and don't give that same flexibility and trust to these NGO leaders and to the communities that they're trying to serve. And so I think this book has done a great job in just highlighting this, not just in what's happening in India, but across sort of regions and countries now that are, citizens are looking to take responsibility of their own issues as they have been for the longest period of time. They just asking for the same level of flexible capital that for-profit entrepreneurs get on a regular basis to solve some of these issues.
Thanks, Deval. That was really great, and you explain the lay of the land extremely well and the challenges that one faces. Rumana, turning to you again, I wanted to ask if you can speak a little bit about how did you go about choosing the focus of your chapter?
Yeah, so I think it was easy for us, right? Because it's something that we've been working in for over 25 years. And we tried to explore, the role of philanthropy in having a ripple effect in creating access to care. And it began as maybe a family commitment or initiative back in 1993, just in one city in India, in Pune. And we used the proof of concept from there. And today we're so proud to be partners with, almost 30 organizations across India. And like Deval says, the health needs in Guwahati are different from Visakhapatnam to Goa. But yet to come together and to prove that, everyone matters. Health outcomes are really, really important. Just about everyone needs the multidisciplinary support that palliative care is advocating, but is not getting any traction for. So, we were told what a silly topic anyway to pick up in philanthropy. Then you're making it a focus of your chapter. And we said that, taking a complex, neglected issue, most people are picking up something that's complex. For us, healthcare comes easier. We've been in the business for now 85 years. So the global South dynamic is something that we have embodied both as a family and as a company legacy, saying that, as Indians and as India, we will always be self-reliant. And we take that into our philanthropy, saying, let's, create solutions for multidisciplinary care ourselves. And let's find ways to go beyond just individual giving, right? And to build a system. So and to work with the public healthcare system. And that's something I'm the most proud of, is that in Mumbai alone, we are in, 4 public health, the medical colleges here. And for us, that's the model. Work very, very closely and very tightly and understand the community's reaction. So for us, choosing this was a way also to articulate what was important to us and why it was important to us and what we, want to continue doing. But I just wanted to say one thing in response to Deval. So Deval, just started a meeting today telling some, communities that we work with that actually we don't do anything, right? We stand on their shoulders and not to get hassled about year ending. That was our responsibility. Forget spend versus utilization. Let us absorb that, bureaucratic hassle, and please go ahead and serve your patients and your hospitals, because that's the only work I'm actually doing, right? Legal compliance. Whereas my partners are in hospitals where they see 5,000 patients a day. So there's no comparison. So I just wanted to take the year ending, this crazy end to saying this is how much we've spent, away from them, because that's the only work I do actually, right? So I do also want other philanthropists to understand, like you were saying, Claire, we have to fund indirect costs. We have to give people the talent and the systems, data management, hospital management systems. Otherwise, we're never going to see beautiful health outcomes. It's just not possible. So that is why we wanted to tell our story, or this story.
Thanks, Rumana, for those very insightful comments. I think also your case study presents very valuable learnings of how I think indigenous philanthropy can unveil less visible often, but critical local needs, and reminds us that even when funding is domestic, I think like as your case study shows, that institutional learning and knowledge can be disseminated globally. So thank you for sharing. Deval, I was wondering if you could describe a little bit your approach in selecting the main themes in your chapter.
Yeah, I think for us, and again, kind of like Rumana was saying, I think even we from the beginning of DASRA 23 years ago knew to trust on NGO leaders, provide them long-term unrestricted funding, and let them make the decisions, not us. And so I think that's something that we've been practicing for a while, and we've been able to see organizations like Magic Bus, Educate Girls, Arman, Lend a Hand India, Ungin Trust. The list goes literally on and on and on of groups that we've supported in a similar manner, and really just enabling them to make these decisions and backing them to the till, again, like a for-profit investor would do with any organization that they invest in. I think for us, though, when COVID happened, we realized that we were supporting organizations and entrepreneurs and NGO leaders who sort of spoke the same English that we did, who had similar experiences that we had, and we didn't do a good enough job in sort of supporting the smaller grassroots organizations across the country who were literally on the front lines when COVID happened, and they were not sort of abiding by whatever rules were put against them in terms of travel, because they knew it was their responsibility to be in front of their community, front and center, day in and day out, with food, with supplies, with medicines, and they were literally putting their lives at risk. And that's when we sort of had this sort of awakening of what happened to this group of organizations. This is the same group, as Rumana sort of touched upon, that are finding it far and more difficult to comply with CSR regulations, which mandate that March 31st programs need to end, which is just ridiculous, because no program, whether it's health, education, or livelihoods, end March 31st, but the government has put fairly strict restrictions on that. These are the same organizations from September 2020 started to receive lesser fundings from sort of foreign sources because changes in the FCRA Act that occurred here. And these are the same organizations, again, that have really kept the country together as we know it. And so I think for us was, how do we get to these organizations? And Claire, to your point, that's where we started accessing networks, existing networks that have been around for decades, and asking these networks to recommend organizations, because if they could vouch for an organization and talk about the multiple things they've done with them over the years, it's far greater than any 20-page proposal, any results framework, or any reference check even that one may do after the fact of making a decision. So instead, we went through the networks. Given time was of necessity, we didn't even then bother the NGOs. We just asked the networks to recommend organizations to us, to give us 3 bullet points on how they would use the money. Then once they received the money, again, to tell us what those 3 bullet points are, and at the end of each year to let us know if those 3 bullet points have changed. Again, these organizations have been there well before we've been there, and they will be there well after that. And I think that sort of understanding and belief, Nithya, is something that we were able to highlight in this book, as well as sort of create the Rebuild India Fund, which is 100% determined by NGO leaders themselves on who gets the funding. It's 5-year unrestricted funding and capacity building support, but really just creating a network of these organizations. And I think what we've seen in the last year in bringing these NGOs together is just the sense of solidarity that they've been missing over the last couple of years for a variety of reasons. But when they come together and they realize, while they're groups that speak different languages, that have different approaches, but that are sort of supporting similar communities across the country, they do get a sense of confidence and a sense of bullishness that they've lost in these couple of years. And I feel that's where it's so important, like Claire was saying, not just to sort of fund these networks, but really create new networks and allow them to come together as one and share best practices. And chances are, what we've seen, at least when we start bringing these groups together, they're so open in sharing best practices and learning from each other, and including recommending other donors that they have to support their friends and peers now across the country. And when you see things like this happen, you realize that it was the donors, honestly, that have created sort of this sort of false competition and false view of the world where the organizations and the communities are very, very much there in terms of sharing, learning, and sort of improving.
Thanks, Deval. I think you've really made a really good case for the urgent need to shift giving practices towards a more equity-focused approach, committed to supporting locally led, scalable solutions that have outcomes of justice, diversity, and inclusion. So thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your chapter. Ramana, I wanted to ask, what guidance would you offer to fellow philanthropists in the Global South who are just beginning their philanthropic journey?
That's a question both Deval and Neera have asked me in the past. And, I just have one word, it's give, give to what you passionately believe in, what you dream about. Just talk to people, right? So talk to people like, Dasra, or even myself, if you're interested in health equity, but just come forward and do what Deval is saying. Have 3 bullet points, nothing else. And even those 3 bullet points, just make sure someone who's been in the field, on the ground, and really understands, so whether it's girl education or it's, child safety and protection, whatever it is that you feel that touches you, right? This is not just the science of giving. This is also about what makes you feel angry, or what gets you happy when you see something. And so I always tell people that, give to that and learn how to give. I think learning how to give and accepting the humility that we don't know how to give is the first step, right? So access the networks, attend meetings, go out in the field, but just take a risk. Just give the money, take a risk. Nothing will go wrong. Do you know what I mean? You're making such big business decisions every day. As long as you can trust the leaders with whom you're investing your money in, you'll be fine. So I just tell people, just get off the chair. Don't do what Deval is saying we did, which is we waited till we are 60. Just say that, I'm 25 years old, and you know what, Deval, I have 5,000 rupees to invest. Where should I go and how should I do it? And how can I participate? And I think that willingness is the only thing you need really to get started on your journey. And that's how you started any journey, right? That's how you chose your college, your life partner, or where you work. So this is just another journey. And I think, just listen to what, both of us are saying, which is that it's going to be so rewarding if you just put your hand up. That's it.
Thanks, Ramana. It's very perceptive and really great advice to listen and to give. Deval, could you please tell us, as co-founder of Dasra, what advice would you give similarly to other Global South philanthropists seeking to showcase their work?
I think Ramana's really, really nice, and that's why I think we complement each other well. I think stay angry, honestly. I think enough is enough, right? People are suffering, and they have been for generations. And I think it's that righteous anger needs to come back, that fire in the belly. When we talk about bold ambition and change, we cannot put the burden of this on the communities themselves and sort of sit here idly without sort of feeling their anger, seeing what they're up against, and again, through love, of course, but supporting them long term. But I think that anger needs to really come back, and I think we've done a bad job at sort of sanitizing philanthropy to a level now where it's not about justice, and I think we need to really talk about the Constitution. We need to talk about justice. We need to talk about equity and dignity far more than we do right now, and the communities we're serving really need that level of anger as well, because they're tired. They're tired of being angry all the time or submissive, and it's up to us to really make that change. And lastly, just remember, the money sitting in your bank account has a 0 ROI. and I think that's really what's critical, and what we all need to realize is just take those checks, write them, go out into the community, start serving like these leaders have been serving their communities for generations, and you will see a change, no questions asked, and no decision is permanent. But stay angry, I think, and really take action. COVID is just the beginning of multiple disasters that the communities we all are trying to serve are going to face. And if they don't thrive, we will not thrive. And I think it's really, really important to realize that.
Thanks, Deval. That's quite a call to action. Stay angry, but it's really what we all need to do to wake up to the injustice in society. Unfortunately, we're drawing close to the end of our session. But Claire, I wanted to ask you to briefly summarize the future plans for the CSP and how they relate to the work of the philanthropists and foundations we've showcased in the book. And also very briefly, where do you see the center in 10 or 15 years?
Thanks, Nitya. Yeah, I mean, just to say, it's hugely inspiring to hear Deval and Romana speak, because this is exactly why the center exists, right? Is to convene these voices. We can do that. We may be sitting in the global north at Cambridge, but and that is the asset we have, is that convening power. And too often, historically, we have only heard the voices from the global north. So really exciting to hear you both talk, because I think this is, as I said at the beginning of a movement. That's why we're here at the CSP. We want to bring these diverse voices together, because we are reinventing the wheel, right? We're really good at that in the philanthropic sector. We have our own executive education program where we're trying to offset that by saying, let's come together collectively and share best practice. And we're also very proud of the fact that our case studies are from the global south. And you wouldn't believe the number of people that have said to us, you're like the only program we know of where you're giving global south case studies. So we want to continue to do that, to be a central hub where people on this call, people like our wonderful authors, can share with us their knowledge. We can do the distribution. You can carry on focusing on your mission. We can support the fact that that this knowledge is hugely valuable. And as we've said, people are more and more willing now to share that knowledge and ensure that we don't reinvent the wheel. And just a couple of final points. Philanthropic capital is risk capital. We need to be going and doing the complicated, difficult stuff that businesses don't want to and governments struggle to. So we have power to collectively when we do that together, because that's when you start to get system change. So that's really, for us as a center, we want to continue the conversation. We want to host the conversation. We want to amplify the conversation. We are hoping to scale up more. We are still a very small center. We're going for a second round of funding this year so that we can get additional financial resources to take our work to an even broader range of markets, because we see the need for this. Philanthropic practitioners are busy, as our wonderful speakers have said. They're on the ground. They're solving the problems. We have the capability to support them from behind the scenes by aggregating knowledge, expertise, examples of where innovation has worked spectacularly well and maybe where it hasn't. So I think that's really our mission at the center, is to continue to support our wonderful authors, to continue sharing. And we hope to have a second edition of the book at some point, but let's get the first one published first before we get overly ambitious. And that's really where I hope in 3 or 5 years' time, 10 years' time, we'll be seen as a central hub repository for sharing knowledge and expertise on Global South philanthropic deployment.
Thanks, Claire. It's great to hear you set out the plans for the center and perhaps what we can all do collectively. Unfortunately, this brings us to the end of the discussion. I'm not sure we have time for audience questions. We can take a couple if we do have time. Deva?
It's up to you, Nitya. I know it's almost 8 o'clock at night here in India, so.
Okay, maybe one. There's one question. I've been asked whether how can the philanthropic sector work more closely with the government? And it's open to all of you to answer. Romana first, and then Deval, and perhaps Claire, you can chime in.
So we actually do work, and we find that the work we do in health and health outcomes, we cannot do without the government, right? So we don't want to integrate our work into charitable hospitals as much as we want to integrate it into public health institutions. And so at every level, we have found that the government institutions have come forward to support our work, to let palliative care in through the door. I was in the UK and they couldn't believe that in India with NIMHANS, which is an government institute in Bangalore, we had set up a neuropalliative outpatient department. And they kept asking me how it's happened. And I said, Dr. Pramita, she runs a government institute on mental health, and she pulled up neuropalliative health, and she's made it happen in Bangalore. And so the ideas come from her, right? She's one of the foremost psychiatrists in South Asia. That's her vision of palliative care. And it's a government institution. It took us a year. Through COVID, they were to set up that partnership, and it's thriving. And we're now making it a showcase for other people who want to invest in neuropalliative care, which is absolutely anyone with dementia, Alzheimer's, MS, stroke. And so people are coming forward and understanding that if we come together with the government, with their solutions, just like we did with NIMHANS, that's the only way we are going to be able to offer innovative solutions that work at scale. So that's my personal view, and also I've seen it playing out in palliative care integration. So I'm now on that path.
Thanks, Romana.
Yeah, no, even sorry, Nitya, but even small NGOs, let's be very clear, they're not creating a parallel system for healthcare, for education, for livelihoods, for government entitlements or schemes, or even replacing laws that may affect the citizens that they serve. They're working very closely with government and government systems, but are sort of complementing what the government is doing. And whether that is focusing on like palliative care, Rumana, I mean, you also, of course, have supported Sneha, and they have just a palliative care center down the street here in Bandra that is a government center that they run in conjunction with the municipality, focusing on providing palliative care and support to the citizens across the city. And small NGOs, I think, do the same. In fact, a recent report that just came out on the India civil society sector for the last 75 years demonstrates most nonprofits across the country work very close with government, hand in hand, and sort of supplement or complement areas that the government may not be able to sort of do on their own. Exactly. And so I don't think it's a question of if. I think everyone is working with the government, and the government is very open, I think, in having these kind of partnerships as well, because they realize that they're great at scale, but they don't have the wherewithal at times to innovate or to sort of, outreach towards a community and improve their programs on a regular basis. And so I think, especially at a local level, I think communities don't actually see the difference between an NGO or the government. It's one system that's providing them support. And then they have a variety of people, of course, who may get paid by a different bank account, but at the end of the day, it's really that singular system that they're being supported by.
No, absolutely right. I think, philanthropists are not taking the place of government. It's just that you can demonstrate, you can take the risks, you can demonstrate success, and then the government can, of course, take that and magnify. That's what's important to remember that. Sadly, this is all we have time for today. And in conclusion, I wanted to say that, clearly mobilizing developed networks to improve philanthropic infrastructure, building strong partnerships with fellow global South actors, and particularly with governments, and creating resilience to offset future crises are key strategies for philanthropy in the global South to become more independent of its reliance on large northern foundations. This panel and our book is an effort to showcase the possibility of different ways of using philanthropic capital to create systems change. And it's also an opportunity, I think, to amplify the voices of leaders in the global South who have already actioned new thinking about how we can do things better. It's also a call to action, like Deval and Romana have so well articulated, for a more united community of global change makers who really believe that philanthropy can have a powerful role in creating this systems change. Thank you once again to our panelists for sharing their valuable insights and experiences. And thank you to all of you who've logged in to listen. And just to note, our book is going to be available soon. It should be published in a month or so. So be patient with us and we'll send the news out on Dastra. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Nitya. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I meant to say that there's a feedback, session feedback. If you could please kindly fill that out before we log off. That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Romana.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.